assemblage of proteins. How blind and purposeless forces could spontaneously produce such a process is unknown, and I believe unknowable, metaphysically impossible. Even the atheist Nobel Prize-winning biologists like Jacques Monod and the DNA co-discoverer Francis Crick regard the emergence of life from chemical realities as almost miraculous. Crick even believed that somehow the inanimate life on Earth was seeded from space with living material. Some have alleged that life might have arisen by chance, but calculations and experiments have shown that the odds to be impossibly high. Moving from amino acids to life, there's one chance in 10 to the power of 40,000, an unimaginable number. The number of subatomic particles in the Eucharist is 10 to the power of 80 or 81. Life didn't come about by chance.
I'd like to thank Cardinal Pell for his insights, and I now call upon Dan Barker to open the case for the negative.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, George. Thank you, Radar, and Tristan. Where's Tristan? Are you Tristan? Show us your shirt. He's got a great shirt on here. The big A atheist symbol, and what does it say underneath there? Good without God. So I think you guys have some for sale there. I wasn't going to plug your table, but of course you can be good without God. That's not even an open question. That's just a fact. Millions of good people all over the planet are good without believing in a God. I flew to Sydney last night. This is my first day in Australia. And this is probably no big deal to you, but I saw some wild ibises right out here, which we don't see in Wisconsin, you know. If you saw a wild bear, you'd probably jump, but it's a real pleasure to be invited to this wonderful country and to see such wonderful thinkers on all sides of the issue, and to be able to debate and dialogue with an informed and compassionate and kind man such as George Pell. Today is, what day of the week is it today? Thursday. You know what that is? We're honoring the existence of the god Thor. Isn't that the god they worship right there in Norway, where you're from?
Correct.
There you go. So, how many of you in this audience believe in the actual existence of Thor? No? And George doesn't either, do you? The only difference between me and George is that I believe in one less God than he does. We all reject beliefs in many types of gods, and I reject belief in the God of the Bible for very good reasons. Of course, I used to believe, as you know, I used to be a preacher. I used to travel the country trying to convert people to Christianity, and I was actually good at it as it goes. I wrote some Christian musicals. I'm still getting royalties today from some of those musicals. What should I do with the money? But I changed my mind, and I wrote some books about it. My newest book is called Godless, and it explains in great detail, more detail than we can talk about tonight, why I changed my mind. So, without God, are we nothing? Let me ask you atheists and agnostics in the audience. Are you nothing?
No.
Aren't you something? Aren't we biological animals? Don't we come with instincts and drives and, even as George points out, purpose to reproduce, to live, to enjoy life? Are we nothing? Who would dare insult our species by saying that our wonderful, beautiful, learning, imperfect, and yet struggling to improve species is merely nothing? Maybe people like George, without God, would feel that they are nothing. They wouldn't have those honorifics or those awards granted to them by a church based on an intellectually feeble book, a scientifically illiterate book, a morally inadequate book of the Bible, an entire world religion based upon very poor teachings. Any one of us in this room could have come up with a better system of thought and morality than that book, or the church that George is advocating for. We are something. We exist. The reasons I gave for rejecting my original belief in God, which was sincere and deep. I used to pray. I used to feel the Spirit. I used to see what I thought were miracles. I used to see what I thought were transformed lives. But I changed my mind because it intellectually does not make sense. It is much more reasonable not to believe in a God than to pretend that these arguments for God make any sense. Reason number one is that there's no evidence for a God. Come on, if there were evidence for a God, we would have heard it tonight. George would have put it on the table and said, here's the evidence for God. Instead, what we heard was evidence for mystery. And George went out of his way to remind us that his arguments are not gods of the gap arguments, but in fact, that's exactly what they are. Here's the mystery. How do you answer it? God did it. Isn't that convenient? How do you explain the fine-tuning of the initial constants? I don't know. God did it. That's not evidence. If there were evidence for a God, by now someone should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing that out. Of course, George is careful to point out that the existence of God is not accessible to natural inquiry, which conveniently removes it from real investigation. Although I think that Dawkins is right to suggest that a universe with a God in it would be different than a universe without a God, and therefore the question of God is, in fact, a scientific question. If a God does exist, as opposed to not existing, we should have some evidence to show the existence of that being. None of that evidence has been offered tonight, and really none of that evidence holds any water. Prophecies, supposed miracles, answers to prayer, changed lives, the existence of the Bible, the existence of the church, all these things are not evidences for a God. They are evidence for a beautifully creative human species trying to make sense of the world that we live in. The second reason is that there are no good arguments for a God. The first cause, the fine-tuning, the teleological, the design arguments, we don't have time to touch on those, or the ontological, or the moral argument, or any of the others today in this brief debate. But when you scratch beneath the surface, I have to agree with Bertrand Russell that all these arguments boil down to bad grammar. They really are not, they really do not produce the results even that the theists are aiming for. And to George's credit, he even admits in his writings that these arguments could be stronger, but they are what they are. The church has these arguments and they are using them. But when I scratch beneath the surface, I realized that the question that the little child asked, who made God, is actually a very good question. If we are allowed to ask that question of ourselves in our universe, why is God exempt from the same question? George says by definition he necessarily exists. But that's just called begging the question. It's a circular logic. Another reason, number 3, is there's never been a coherent definition of a God ever offered. No one has ever defined what a God is. In fact, many of the definitions, including the Christian definition of God, most Christian definitions, define God in ways that are mutually incompatible. It's like arguing whether or not a married bachelor exists. The God of Christianity is a God who knows the future and is all-powerful and has free will, and yet, if you know the future, you can't change the future. It's an argument I came up with called FANG, the free will argument for the non-existence of God. If God knows the future, he is powerless to change it. And to say that he somehow lives outside of time means that he doesn't exist. To live outside of existence is not to exist. No one has ever properly defined the word spirit, or spiritual, or supernatural. Those are simply words. George, in his works, uses the word beyond and wider. The spiritual word is beyond, it is wider. But what does the word beyond and wide mean? Aren't those dimensional words? Aren't those natural words? Until you theists define properly the words you are using, you may as well just say God is a blah. Because what does the word spirit mean? How do you measure it? How much does it weigh? How much space does it take up? How does the spirit differ from nothing at all? Isn't it just a word? A fourth reason is that there are no good replies to the positive arguments against the existence of a God. Walk into any children's hospital and you know there is no God. Those parents who desperately love their children, they're praying, they're asking for a miracle, and yet they see those children die horrible deaths at the same rate as random chance. If there were a God, the universe should be different from what it is.